Welcome to a brand new deep dive. We usually start these conversations by talking about how the world works, or, well, at least how we desperately want it to work.
Right. How we wish it worked.
Exactly, because we all have this deep-seated, almost biological expectation of, like, a perfectly balanced ledger.
Oh, absolutely. It's a basic moral accounting.
Yeah, you put in the long hours at the office, you get the promotion, you eat your vegetables, you lower your cholesterol.
You go to church, you tithe, you raise your kids right, and your family thrives.
Yeah.
I mean, we love moral math.
We really do. We love it because it's clean, it's predictable, and, it gives us this illusion of control.
It is the ultimate human comfort blanket. We just crave a universe that can be categorized and managed. When the inputs and the outputs make sense, we feel safe.
But then you step out of the theoretical and into the real world.
Yeah.
You walk into a hospital room to visit a faithful, lifelong believer, someone who has served their community, loved their family, pursued righteousness, who just got a devastating, totally unexplainable diagnosis.
Or you get the midnight phone call about a tragic accident.
Right, and suddenly that carefully balanced ledger is completely shredded. The map just stops working entirely.
It completely collapses.
And that void, that terrifying space where our formulas collapse, is exactly where we are heading today. We are exploring one of the most profound, ancient, and honestly deeply misunderstood texts in human history, which is the Book of Job.
For anyone navigating ministry, or leading a small group, preparing a Sunday school lesson, or just personally wrestling with the heavy realities of life in a fallen world, I mean, this text is completely unavoidable. It confronts the shattering of our moral math head on.
To tackle this, we have an incredible stack of sources today. We're going to be working directly from the primary source Hebrew text, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia.
Which is the standard scholarly edition of the Masoretic text, for those who might not know.
Right, and we are pairing that original language work with a really rigorous scholarly structural document titled Survey of Job Analysis.
A fantastic resource.
So our mission today is to move far beyond the oversimplified, a Sunday school summary of Job.
Yeah, the flannel graph version.
Exactly. The version where he's just this patient sufferer who waits quietly, never complains, and then eventually gets double his stuff back.
Which is not the actual book of Job at all.
Not even close. We are going to completely deconstruct that. We want to uncover this text's gritty historical roots, its stunning literary architecture, and its absolute takedown of transactional religion.
And crucially, how it serves as a critical, irreplaceable bridge in redemptive history that points straight to the incarnation.
We're going to unpack why this ancient text's answer to the problem of suffering is completely counterintuitive to how our modern rationalistic minds work.
Well, and by the end of this, you'll see why a text written millennia ago is arguably the most relevant theological framework for modern tragedies.
So let's jump in. We have this incredibly ancient, gritty setting, but the puzzle of Job begins before we even read the first verse.
It really does.
We have to ground ourselves in when and where this story takes place. And looking at the evidence, there is a serious historical timeline puzzle we need to solve here.
Yeah, we have to draw a hard line between the historical setting of the events themselves and the time of the book's final composition.
Right.
As conservative evangelical scholars, when we approach the text, we have to recognize that the story time and the writing time are separated by, well, a vast gulf of centuries.
Let's start with the story time then. Where are we geographically and chronologically?
We are in what scholars call the patriarchal setting. This places the actual events of Job's life in the early second millennium BC.
So roughly contemporary with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Exactly. The text tells us Job lives in the land of Uz. Based on biblical geography and external ancient Near Eastern evidence, Uz is located east of Canaan, somewhere near Edom and the North Arabian Desert.
Wow. Okay. So we are talking about a very rugged, nomadic, pastoral environment.
Very much so.
And the internal evidence from the Hebrew text anchors this in a very specific ancient reality. I mean, look at the markers of his life. The text explicitly states that Job lives 140 years after his restoration.
Right, which is huge.
It is, because if you factor in his age before the tragedy, his total lifespan is approaching 200 years.
And that aligns perfectly with the extended lifespans recorded in the pre-Mosaic patriarchal era in Genesis.
Right, like Abraham lived to be 175, his father Terah lived to 205. But by the time you get to the era of David, the Psalms tell us a normal lifespan is, 70 or 80 years?
Yeah, exactly. The economic markers in the text point to the exact same era, too. Job's incredible wealth is quantified entirely by livestock.
We're talking thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, female donkeys.
Right, and there is zero mention of minted coinage throughout his entire period of prosperity.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and when currency finally is mentioned at the very end of the book, in Job 42.11, his brothers and sisters console him by giving him a piece of silver. And the Hebrew word used there is kiyata.
Casita.
Yes, and this is an archaic, extremely rare unit of silver that appears elsewhere only in patriarchal contexts. Specifically, when Jacob buys a plot of land in Genesis 33, and then there's a retroactive reference in Joshua 24.
Wow. And here is another massive chronological indicator, especially for those familiar with Old Testament law. In Job 1.5, Job acts as the priest for his own family.
Yeah, this is a big one.
It describes him rising early in the morning to offer burnt offerings for his children, just in case they had sinned. If this story took place after the Exodus, like after the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, Job's actions would be completely illegal.
Oh, they would be highly heretical. I mean, the formal Levitical priesthood under Moses strictly prohibited patriarchal family heads from offering sacrifices like this. Only the sons of Aaron could approach the altar. So the fact that Job operates as a priest for his family firmly roots him in a redemptive historical period way before the Abrahamic and Mosaic covenants narrowed down the priestly community.
To put an analogy on this, it's like finding a beautifully bound, professionally printed novel, right? But as you read it, you realize the characters are bartering with beaver pelts instead of dollars.
That's a great way to think about it.
And the father is acting as the town doctor, the town judge, and the local pastor, and they are navigating virgin wilderness. You would immediately know, well, the book itself might have been published recently, but the events it describes are set on the pioneer frontier centuries earlier.
Exactly. It anchors the story in a very specific, gritty reality.
But this raises a crucial question. If the events are patriarchal, when did someone actually sit down and compose this masterpiece of Hebrew wisdom literature?
Well, the final poetic text as we have was likely composed much later. Conservative scholarship generally points to two highly plausible eras for the final compilation.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is the Solomonic era, the 10th century BC. This was without a doubt the golden age of Israelite wisdom literature. Solomon's court was this incredible intellectual hub.
Famous for its international trade and, the cross-cultural exchange of wisdom motifs from Egypt and Arabia.
Right. It would be the absolute perfect environment for an ancient patriarchal account to be formalized into this high Hebrew poetry.
And the second option?
The exilic period, around the 6th century BC. This is when the nation of Israel was dragged into Babylonian captivity.
Ah, right. So they had lost their land, their temple, their Davidic king.
They were suffering immense, seemingly disproportionate corporate tragedy. You can easily imagine how the Book of Job would be heavily studied, edited, and disseminated during that crucible.
Because the Israelites were asking those deep questions about why God would allow such suffering.
Exactly. And Job provided a framework for enduring when the covenant promises seemed to have completely failed.
So, the author, writing either during the height of Israel's intellectual golden age or the absolute depths of its exile, intentionally chooses an ancient pre-Israelite setting. Why do that?
It's a brilliant move.
I mean, why not just make Job a good Israelite king who follows the law of Moses? What does removing the story from the framework of the Torah allow the author to do?
It strips away all the institutional safety nets. By placing Job outside the Mosaic covenant, outside the sacrificial system of the temple, and outside the promised land, the author isolates the core theological issue.
It makes it universal.
Yes,
It was
because a universal human question. It forces the reader to look at suffering and divine justice without falling back on the mechanical, legal answers of the Torah.
It also allows the author to engage in some aggressive cultural polemics, because we know from our sources that Israel wasn't the only nation writing righteous sufferer texts. There are major ancient Near Eastern parallels.
Oh, absolutely. The most famous parallel is the Babylonian work Ludlul Bul Nameki,
which scholars often just call the Babylonian Job.
Right. It tells the story of a nobleman named Shub-Shemeshra Shakan who loses his position, his health, and his wealth, and he just cries out in despair to the Babylonian god Marduk.
But when you actually read the text side by side, Job doesn't copy the Babylonian myth. It completely subverts it.
Completely. In the Babylonian text, the gods are just capricious. They act like spoiled, unpredictable politicians.
Right. The sufferer's primary goal is just trying to find the right magical incantation or the right ritual or the right bribe to appease whatever deity happens to be angry at him that day.
And that highlights the sheer brilliance of the Book of Job. Job's God is not a petty deity demanding to be manipulated by magic. He is the sovereign creator of the cosmos.
Wow, yeah.
The Babylonian sufferer repents of minor ritual infractions, just hoping to buy back his health. Job, as we will see, fiercely maintains his moral integrity and demands justice from a moral God.
Such a contrast.
It is. Job provides a distinct, irreplaceable vantage point that tells the ancient Near Eastern world and tells us today that Yahweh operates on a level of holy wisdom that totally transcends human economics and pagan mythologies.
That historical tension, taking this ancient, raw pain and turning it into a theological argument, it brings us to the literary architecture of the book.
Which is fascinating.
It really is.
Yeah.
How did the author physically build this text to capture that pain? Because in Job, the structure itself isn't just packaging, it is a theological argument.
When we talk about the literary genre of Job, people often just casually toss it into the category of theodicy, which is, the philosophical defense of God's goodness in the face of the existence of evil.
Right.
But our source material, drawing on scholars like P. Zerfa, suggests that wisdom debate is a much more precise and helpful genre classification.
Why is wisdom debate a better fit than theodicy? I mean, isn't he defending God?
Because a theodicy implies that God is the one on trial, and the author is trying to get him off the hook.
Oh.
But Job is doing something much more aggressive. It is aggressively interrogating the source of wisdom itself. It's asking where wisdom is found when human observation completely fails.
And the way the author structures this debate gives the reader absolute whiplash. You open the book, chapters 1 and 2, and you are reading a tidy, predictable, neatly packaged prose narrative.
It reads almost like a fable.
Yes. Then you turn the page to chapter 3, and the prose completely shatters, and you are plunged into this massive, chaotic, emotionally violent, poetic dialogue for dozens of chapters.
And then, at the very end, it snaps right back into a neat prose epilogue.
That structural juxtaposition has to be intentional.
Oh, it is entirely intentional. The author is doing something masterful with the emotional and logical arc of the book.
Right.
Let's look at the Hebrew in the very first verse, Job 1.1, to see how he sets up this prose prologue.
Okay.
Job is described as Tommy Arvarelechum.
Walk us through that Hebrew phrasing. What picture is the author painting there?
It translates to blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. It is a rhythmic, formulaic, perfectly balanced description.
Wow.
In the Hebrew, it sounds incredibly stable. The prose format mimics how ancient people, and frankly, how we today think the universe should work.
It establishes a universe of perfect moral symmetry. Good guy does good things, avoids bad things, and therefore gets good rewards. It feels incredibly safe.
But then the bottom falls out. In a matter of hours, Job loses his economic empire. All 10 of his children are crushed in a bizarre weather event. And shortly after, he is struck with a horrific, disfiguring skin disease.
And then the tidy prose shatters into poetry. Why make that shift?
Because pain is poetic. Pain does not speak in neat, bulleted prose.
That's a great point.
When you are sitting in the ashes of your life, you don't use syllogisms. You use metaphor, hyperbole, and chaotic, gut-wrenching poetry. The structure of the book forces the reader to leave the safe, theoretical theology of the prologue and sit in the messy, unresolved trauma of the dialogue.
Before we even leave that prose prologue, though, there is a fascinating word trick happening in the original text. The author uses a literary device that our sources identify as antithetical polysemy.
That is a very dense academic term, but the concept is brilliant. Essentially, it means using a word to mean its exact opposite, usually as a euphemism. And the author centers this wordplay entirely on the Hebrew verb barak.
Normally, barak is one of the most holy words in the Old Testament. It means to bless. We see it all over the Psalms. Bless the Lord, O my soul.
Yes, but the author of Job takes this holy word and twists it ironically to mean to curse or to blaspheme.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the ancient scribes were so uncomfortable with the idea of writing the words curse God next to each other that they used barak as a euphemism, and the author turns it into a central thematic tension.
We see this tension immediately in chapter 1. Job offers those early morning sacrifices because he fears his children might have partied a little too hard, and Barku blessed, meaning cursed God in their hearts.
Exactly. And the adversary, the Satan figure operating as the prosecuting attorney in the heavenly court, uses the exact same wordplay.
Right.
He makes a cosmic bet with God. He challenges God's moral accounting in Job 1:11, saying, "Stretch out your hand and strike all that he has, and he will surely Barak bless," meaning curse you to your face.
And this wordplay hits its devastating peak in Job 2.9. Job is sitting in the city dump, covered in boils, scraping his infected skin with a piece of broken pottery. His wife, who has also just lost all 10 of her children and her entire standing in society, looks at him and delivers the fatal blow.
Yeah.
She says, Baruch Womit, literally, bless God and die, but contextually, functionally, she is screaming, curse God and die.
It is absolutely chilling.
You know, this makes me deeply uncomfortable as a reader, and I have to imagine that is the author's intent, because if the exact same Hebrew word is used for bless and curse, what did that say about our own motives for worship?
No,
Like, does the text imply that if we are only blessing God just to get material wealth, health, and security, it is functionally the same thing as cursing him?
you've hit the exact nerve the author intended to strike. This book is a mirror. It forces the reader to examine the transactional nature of their own faith.
Right.
If you only bless God because he blesses your bank account, your health, and your family, then your worship isn't worship at all. It is a manipulation tactic. It's a bribe.
The adversary's whole argument is that Job doesn't actually love God. Job just loves God's stuff. Job loves the benefits package of the covenant.
And the Barak wordplay exposes how razor-thin the line is between transactional worship and outright blasphemy. When the blessings stop, your true theology is revealed. If your theology relies on a vending machine God, the moment the machine breaks, you will curse him.
That tension between true disinterested worship and transactional manipulation that brings us directly into the massive, chaotic center of the book. The wisdom debate between Job and his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar.
And when we teach this in a local church setting, we have to be very careful not to introduce the friends as villains.
Right, they aren't cartoon antagonists.
Exactly. In the context of the ancient world, these three men are the respected Orthodox theologians of their day. When they hear of Job's tragedy, they travel from distant regions, tear their robes, throw dust on their heads, and sit with him in total silence for 7 days.
Sitting in silence for a week is incredible pastoral care. It's the ministry of presence. The problem only starts when they finally open their mouths.
That's where things go off the rails.
Yeah, because when they start talking, they reveal their worldview, which is built entirely on what scholars call the retribution principle.
The retribution principle is the idea that the universe operates on a rigid, mechanical, uncompromising moral equation. Goodness always brings prosperity, and sin always brings suffering. There are absolutely no exceptions.
It is the ultimate cosmic vending machine analogy.
Right.
You put in the coin of good deeds, you press the button, and you expect to get a good life out the bottom. Job's friends are looking at the devastation of Job's life and applying their airtight logic.
Their syllogism is flawless based on their premise. Premise A, God is perfectly just and punishes sinners while rewarding the righteous. Premise B, Job is experiencing the most catastrophic, horrific punishment imaginable. Conclusion, Job must have committed a massive, heinous, secret sin to warrant this level of wrath.
They just don't have a category in their theology for innocent suffering. If the machine didn't give you a candy bar, well, you must have used a counterfeit coin. You must be a hypocrite.
That's their only conclusion.
Let's break down how they attacked Job because they each take a slightly different angle, right? Eliphaz is the first to speak. What is his approach?
Eliphaz the mystic. He leans heavily on spiritual experience. In chapter 4, he talks about a terrifying vision he had in the night, where a spirit passed before his face and whispered to him that mortal man cannot be more righteous than God. Eliphaz starts out relatively gentle, suggesting that perhaps Job just made a minor mistake and needs to accept God's discipline.
But then Bildad steps up, and he takes a very different route.
Bildad is the traditionalist. He appeals to ancient history and the wisdom of the fathers. In chapter 8, he essentially tells Job to look at the patterns of history.
He's pretty harsh, isn't he?
Very harsh. He even cruelly suggests that Job's children died because they were sinners and God was just giving them what they deserved. Bildad's argument is that the moral order of the universe is established, and Job is arrogantly fighting against gravity.
Wow. And finally, we get to Zophar.
Zophar is the dogmatist. He is blunt, aggressive, and highly legalistic. In chapter 11, Zophar basically tells Job to shut up.
Literally just shut up.
Yes. He says that God is actually punishing Job less than his guilt deserves. Zophar represents the extreme, merciless end of the retribution principle.
So how does Job handle this barrage of theological friendly fire?
This is where Job becomes utterly radical. Culturally speaking, the expected response for someone in Job's position would be to offer a fake, appeasing confession.
To just say, you know what, guys, you're right. I must have sinned. God forgive me for whatever I did.
Exactly. He could have offered a counterfeit repentance just to make the suffering stop, just to appease the deity, exactly like the sufferers in the Babylonian myths we talked about.
But Job absolutely refuses to do that. He vehemently maintains his innocence. He essentially screams, "My coin was real, I was blameless, the machine must be broken." He refuses to lie to God in order to get his stuff back.
Job violently maintains his integrity. And by doing so, he forces the friends and the reader into a massive theological crisis.
Because if Job is truly innocent, as the narrator and God himself establish in chapter 1, then the retribution principle is fundamentally flawed.
It shatters their entire worldview.
The book of Job serves as a canonical corrective against this rigid view of karma or retribution. It insists that personal sin is not the only explanation for human misery. And we see this exact theological battle play out centuries later in the New Testament.
Yes, Jesus addresses this directly in John chapter 9. The disciples see a man who has been blind since birth. Their immediate reaction is to ask the retribution principle question.
They say, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?"
Exactly. They sound exactly like Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar.
And how does Jesus dismantle that theology?
Jesus replies, "It was not that this man sinned, or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him."
Wow.
Jesus shatters the cosmic vending machine. He affirms what the book of Job fought so hard to establish. There are categories of suffering that have absolutely nothing to do with personal punishment and everything to do with a larger sovereign purpose.
So, Job and his friends debate for almost 40 chapters. They reach a complete hostile deadlock. The friends essentially label Job a heretic, and Job basically calls God to the witness stand. He demands his day in court. He wants God to hand over the indictment and explain the math. How does God finally answer this demand?
God answers out of a violent storm, a theophany, a whirlwind. But what is most fascinating about the climax of this book is not just that God speaks, but what is conspicuously missing from God's response.
Right, because God never pulls back the curtain and tells Job about the adversary's bet in chapter 1.
Never.
He never says, "Hey, Job, I'm really sorry about the kids and the boils, but Satan and I had a wager to prove your faithfulness." Job lives the rest of his life and goes to his grave never knowing the background story of the prologue.
Think about that. God never gives Job a direct intellectual explanation for the why of his specific suffering. He never justifies his actions according to human legal standards.
Instead of a courtroom defense, what does God offer?
God asserts his unique, vast cosmic wisdom. His long... Yes, God takes Job on a breathtaking, terrifying virtual tour of the cosmos. He asks Job a series of rhetorical questions about the foundations of the earth, the binding of the constellations, the feeding habits of wild lions, and the bizarre behavior of the ostrich.
Right.
He points to Behemoth and Leviathan, symbols of primordial chaos, and shows that only Yahweh can tame them.
There is one specific beautiful example highlighted in our source material that really captures the essence of God's argument. In chapter 38, verse 26, God asks Job, "Who sends rain on a land without people, on a desert where no human lives, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass?" Why is this specific question about rain so profound?
Because in the ancient world, and honestly in our world today, rain is primarily viewed as an economic resource.
You need rain to grow crops, feed your livestock, sustain your family.
Right, to build wealth.
Yeah.
From a human perspective, raining on an uninhabited desert is a complete waste of resources.
It violates human economic logic.
Precisely. And that is the theological shift happening in the whirlwind. God is forcing Job to realize that the universe is not human-centered. God is showing Job that his meticulous wisdom, his ova, and his profound care extend to corners of reality that have absolutely no economic usefulness to humanity. He waters the desert simply because he loves the desert. He sustains ecosystems that no human eye will ever see.
So God is basically saying, if I manage the chaotic, non-human elements of the cosmos with such precise, loving wisdom that makes zero sense to your internal ledgers, can you trust me with the chaotic elements of your own life?
That is the absolute crux of the whirlwind. God's actions are good, and they are purposeful, even when they completely defy human rational analysis.
Which leads us to Job's ultimate aha moment. Job's response to this overwhelming display of sovereignty is incredibly telling, because he doesn't say, oh, okay, now I understand the mechanics of my suffering. Thanks for the PowerPoint presentation on meteorology.
Right, his epistemological framework completely shifts.
Exactly. In Job 42.5, Job says, Lanjmas metheka kenirai. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you.
He moves from secondhand theological knowledge hearing about God to a firsthand, terrifying, beautiful encounter seeing God.
That's powerful.
The ultimate conclusion of the book regarding suffering is the absolute sufficiency of divine presence over intellectual explanations. Job is satisfied at the end. He repents in dust and ashes, but he doesn't repent of secret sins that caused his suffering. He repents of his arrogance in demanding that God conform to his limited human logic.
Right.
He is satisfied not because he got a theological white paper on the problem of evil, but because he encountered the Creator.
For those listening who are in pastoral ministry, this has massive implications for how we counsel the suffering.
It changes everything.
Yeah.
When you are sitting across from someone in your congregation who is enduring the darkest, most agonizing pain of their life, they will think, and you will be tempted to think, that an intellectual why will heal them.
We all have this false notion that if we can just properly explain the theology of suffering, if we can parse the sovereignty of God and the free will of man, the pain will somehow stop.
But Job argues that an explanation is an incredibly poor substitute for a presence.
Only a profound encounter with the presence of the Creator can actually provide peace in the chaos.
Exactly. When you are counseling the suffering, your job isn't to be Job's friends. Your job isn't to diagnose the unexplainable or defend God's reputation. Your job is to sit in the ashes with them, minister with your presence, and gently point them toward the presence of the Lord.
That is incredibly challenging, but deeply freeing for anyone in ministry. Now, we need to transition from how Job resolves his own crisis, or rather how God resolves it for him, to how this entire book functions within the broader canon of Scripture.
This is where it gets really exciting.
Because for a long time, I just viewed Job as this weird, depressing island of a book right in the middle of my Bible, disconnected from the grand narrative of Israel.
Viewing Job in isolation is a massive mistake. The book of Job acts as a vital, load-bearing bridge in redemptive history. To understand this, we have to look at the progression of biblical revelation, starting with the Mosaic covenant.
The covenant God makes with Israel at Mount Sinai.
Specifically, look at Deuteronomy 28, which lays out the national blessings and curses. The framework is very clear. If Israel, as a nation, obeys the law, they will prosper in the land.
They will have agricultural abundance, military victory, economic dominance.
But if they disobey, they will suffer famine, defeat, and ultimately exile. It is a national covenantal retribution principle.
So how does Job challenge or build upon that Deuteronomy framework?
Job takes that national covenantal framework and subjects it to a brutal individual crucible. Job proves that for the individual believer, catastrophic suffering can occur entirely without personal sin.
By breaking the rigid application of the retribution principle, Job actually prepares the reader's theological palette for the prophets.
It sets the stage for Isaiah, yes.
Because without the book of Job breaking the mold of Deuteronomy 28, the ultimate prophetic vision of the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 would be totally incomprehensible.
Exactly. Job prepares the ancient mind for the concept of substitutionary reality, the radical idea that a perfectly innocent, righteous person could suffer terribly, not for their own sins, but according to the sovereign, mysterious will of God.
Right. If the Israelites only had Deuteronomy 28, they would look at a suffering Messiah and assume he was being punished by God for his own horrific sins.
Which is exactly what Isaiah 53 says we naturally do. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But Job teaches us that the righteous can suffer innocently. Without Job, the cross of Jesus Christ would make absolutely no theological sense.
But Job isn't just a philosophical bridge preparing us for the concept of the cross. Job is desperately, actively crying out for a person. In the middle of his despair, feeling crushed by the transcendence of God, Job cries out for an arbiter.
Yes. In Job 9.33, he laments the vast gulf between humanity and the divine. He says, "There is no arbiter between us who might lay his hand on us both." The Hebrew word he uses is motha. It means an umpire, a mediator, a daysman.
I love that image. Someone who has the authority to put one hand on the shoulder of a holy God and the other hand on the shoulder of a broken, infected man in the ashes and bring them together.
It's a beautiful picture.
But in the context of the Old Testament, I mean, who could possibly fill that role? A priest? A prophet? Doesn't Job's incredibly specific longing for an arbiter, this modia, transform this book from a depressing ancient poem about bad luck into a massive neon sign pointing straight to the necessity of the incarnation?
It absolutely does, because a human priest is still fundamentally flawed and cannot truly grasp the divine shoulder. Job realizes that a mere human mediator isn't enough.
Right.
And so his theology takes a massive, desperate leap forward. In chapter 19, verse 25, he makes one of the most stunning, famous declarations in the entire Old Testament. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth.
Break down that word redeemer.
The Hebrew word is grul. In ancient Israelite culture, a girdle was a kinsman redeemer. Think of Boaz in the book of Ruth.
Okay, the kinsman redeemer was a close male relative who had the legal obligation to step in and buy back a family member who had sold themselves into slavery.
Or to buy back family land that had been lost, or even to avenge the blood of a murdered relative.
So Job, feeling entirely abandoned by God functioning as the cosmic judge, appeals to a different aspect of the divine character. He expresses this radical, almost paradoxical faith that a divine kinsman redeemer will step into the dust of the earth and vindicate him against the false accusations of his friends and the adversary.
He is longing for the incarnation. Job is crying out for a Moya and a Gorel. He's demanding a God-man. And that transforms this book from an ancient poem about suffering into a massive neon sign pointing straight to the necessity of Jesus Christ.
Job serves as a profound historical and literary type of Christ. When you lay the life of Job over the life of Jesus, the parallels are just staggering.
Both Job and Jesus are presented as innocent, perfectly righteous sufferers. Both face the direct, targeted assaults of the adversary. Both are stripped of everything and bear the false, mocking accusations of those closest to them.
Right, and both experience a devastating, agonizing sense of divine abandonment. Job screams at the heavens in his isolation, and Jesus hangs on the cross crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
But we must also note the critical contrast, because Jesus is the greater Job. Job wrestled with confusion, he demanded answers, he cursed the day of his birth, and he challenged God's justice.
While Christ walked into his suffering with perfect, silent submission to the Father's will. Quote, like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth.
Jesus is the ultimate Moriah, the mediator between God and man. Jesus is the living dole who stood upon the earth, conquered the grave, and forever vindicates his people.
It's no wonder that early Christians felt this Christological connection so deeply.
No, it makes perfect sense.
This historical note in our source material mentions that it was common practice in the early church to read the book of Job during Passion Week, right alongside the gospel accounts of Christ's crucifixion. They understood that Job's suffering was a prophetic shadow of the ultimate innocent sufferer.
Even the very end of the book points to the cross.
Oh, how so?
After all the hostile debate, think about how Job's story resolves with his friends. God tells the friends they were wrong, and he tells them to go to Job so Job can pray for them.
Oh, wow.
When Job intercedes for his three friends, after they have spent chapters falsely accusing him and tearing him down, it is a stunning picture of Christ on the cross praying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And Job's ultimate restoration and vindication points directly to Christ's resurrection.
It is a phenomenal, breathtaking survey of a text that demands we grow up in our faith. It forces us out of the nursery of transactional religion and into the mature, rugged terrain of relational, trusting faith in a sovereign, immensely wise God.
This text equips us to suffer well, and it equips us to sit with others in their suffering, pointing them not to easy answers, but to the presence of the Savior who suffered for them.
So let's briefly recap the journey we've taken today. We've traced Job from the ancient dusty land of Uz, with its patriarchal wealth and pre-Israelite family priesthood. We explored the deliberate architectural whiplash of moving from pristine prose to violent poetry.
We waded through a brilliantly crafted, agonizing debate that completely dismantles the cosmic vending machine theology of the retribution principle.
We stood in the terrifying whirlwind of divine presence, realizing that intimacy with the Creator is infinitely greater than receiving an explanation from Him. And finally, we saw how Job's desperate cries for a mediator serve as a prophetic shadow of Jesus Christ, our living Redeemer.
It's an incredible journey.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder as we close this deep dive. Let's go back to that image from the whirlwind, the rain falling in the desolate desert. If God's meticulous wisdom and profound, tender care extend to watering the barren, unpopulated corners of the earth where no human eye will ever see the flowers bloom, what does that say about His unseen presence in the desolate, seemingly wasted seasons of your own life? What if the wilderness you are in right now isn't punishment, but a place where God is doing a profound work that only He can see?